In the history of European diplomacy, there are issues so complex that they become a puzzle, a knot that seems impossible to untangle, and none is more complex and confusing than the Schleswig-Holstein problem. An English statesman once joked that only 3 people in the world had ever truly understood it. One was dead, one was mad, and the third was himself, but he had forgotten it. But for the people who lived in this land, it was no joke. It was a vital issue of identity, language, and loyalty. The duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, located on the Jutland Peninsula, were a hybrid land where Danish and German cultures met and clashed for centuries. Holstein, the duchy to the south, was almost entirely German and a member of the loose German Confederation. Schleswig in the north was a mix. The northern part spoke Danish, thus the southern part German. The complications did not stop with ethnicity. Legally, they were a mess. Both duchies were ruled by the King of Denmark, but not as King of Denmark, but as Duke of Schleswig and Duke of Holstein. They were bound to each other and to Denmark by a complex personal bond. A 15th century treaty declared that the 2 duchies would remain forever indivisible, up ewig ungedeeld, but their systems of succession were different. The Kingdom of Denmark allowed women to succeed to the throne, while the duchies followed Salic law, which only allowed men to succeed. For centuries, this strange arrangement persisted, but in the 19th century, the rise of 2 powerful flames, Danish nationalism and German nationalism, turned a complex legal issue into a powder keg. The national liberals in Denmark wanted to create a unified, modern nation-state. They wanted to abolish old privileges and completely annex Schleswig to the Kingdom of Denmark, possibly giving up Holstein to the Germans. They chanted the slogan, "Denmark to the Eider," the river that was Schleswig's southern boundary. By contrast, German nationalists in both duchies and throughout Germany saw Schleswig and Holstein as inseparable German lands. They wanted to free them from Danish domination and unite them into a future unified German state. For them, Schleswig-Holstein was a symbol of German division and impotence. This conflict first erupted in 1848, a year of revolutions across Europe. The Germans in Schleswig-Holstein revolted, supported by the Prussian army and other German states. The First Schleswig War broke out, but after 3 years of fighting, under diplomatic pressure from major powers such as Britain, France, and Russia, who did not want Prussia to become too strong, the Prussian army was forced to retreat. Denmark was victorious. The rebel German nobility was exiled, but the root problem remained unresolved. To prevent another conflict, the powers imposed a solution through the London Protocol of 1852. This protocol was a complex compromise. It recognized the integrity of the Danish state, including the duchies. It also resolved the question of succession by designating Prince Christian of Glucksburg as heir to both the kingdom and the duchies. But in return, Denmark promised not to annex Schleswig and to respect the separate rights of both duchies. It was an attempt to freeze the situation, to maintain a fragile equilibrium. But it was only a temporary solution. The problem became urgent when King Frederick VII of Denmark grew old without a son. Who would succeed him? According to the London Protocol, it would be Prince Christian, but German nationalists found another candidate, Prince Frederick of Augustenburg, who had a more legitimate line of succession under Salic law of the duchies. The fire began to smolder again, and at this time, a new powerful and cunning figure emerged on the political scene in Berlin. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian prime minister, was not really interested in the fate of the Germans in Schleswig-Holstein. For him, nationalism was just a tool. His real goal was much larger, to unite Germany under Prussian leadership and eliminate the rival Austria from the picture. He told a friend, "The Schleswig-Holstein question is an ideal problem for a master diplomat," and he considered himself that diplomat. He saw in this crisis a golden opportunity to achieve his goals. In Copenhagen, the Danish nationalist liberals were also becoming more assertive. Ignoring the London Protocol, they drafted a new joint constitution for Denmark and Schleswig, known as the November Constitution. This constitution, in effect, annexed Schleswig to the Kingdom of Denmark. It was a direct challenge to the German states and a blatant violation of the 1852 agreement. Fate had a twist of fate. On 13th of November 1863, King Frederick VII signed the November Constitution. He died just 2 days later. His successor, Christian IX, now faced a terrible dilemma. If he did not ratify the Constitution, he would be branded a traitor in Copenhagen and risk being overthrown by a revolution. If he ratified it, he would trigger a war with the German states. Under pressure, he chose to ratify it. This action caused a storm of indignation throughout Germany. Prince Frederick of Augustenburg declared himself Duke of Schleswig-Holstein. The smaller German states in the Confederation enthusiastically supported him and sent troops to occupy Holstein. But Bismarck had other plans. He did not want a new independent Duchy of Augustenburg, which would have sided with Austria. He wanted these duchies for Prussia. Bismarck acted with genius. He ignored the nationalist wave and instead insisted on the legality of the London Protocol, an international treaty. He argued that Denmark had violated the treaty. In this way, he transformed the crisis from a nationalist revolution into a matter of enforcing international law. More importantly, he persuaded Austria, Prussia's rival, to join in a joint action. Together, the two great powers issued an ultimatum to Denmark to repeal the November Constitution within 48 hours or face war. The Danes made a fatal error in their calculations. They hoped for the intervention of other powers, especially Britain, as in the First World War. The British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, spoke strongly, declaring that if Denmark were attacked, it would not be alone. But these were only empty words. Britain was not ready to go to war over a complex and distant issue. France was busy in Mexico. Russia was still angry with Denmark over other issues. Denmark was completely alone. When the deadline for the ultimatum passed, fate was sealed. On February 1st, 1864, Prussian and Austrian troops, under the command of Prussian Field Marshal Friedrich Graf von Wrangel, crossed the Eider and entered Schleswig. The Second Schleswig War had begun. For Denmark, it was a war to defend national integrity. But for Bismarck, it was the first calculated step carefully in the great gamble to unify Germany with blood and iron. When the Prussian and Austrian armies poured into Schleswig, the disparity in strength was evident from the start. Facing nearly 60,000 German-Austrian troops, the Danish army could muster only about 44,000 men, stretched thin over a wide front. Their commander, General Christian de Meza, was a seasoned veteran of the First World War, but he faced an entirely different enemy, one that had undergone a military revolution. The Prussian army, whose in particular was a new war machine. Reorganized by von Roon and led by talented officers trained by Moltke, it was a professional, disciplined, and well-equipped force. But their decisive weapon, the one that would define the wars of German unification, was a revolutionary infantry rifle, the breech-loading Dries rifle, or needle gun. The breech-loading rifle gave the Prussians a tremendous tactical advantage. They could fire 3 to 5 times faster than their opponents. More importantly, they could reload while lying or kneeling, making them a much smaller target. Meanwhile, the Danes, armed with breech-loading rifles, still had to stand up to reload, an act that was almost suicidal on the modern battlefield. This war would be a brutal test of technological disparity, pitting Danish courage against Prussian superior firepower. Another technological advantage for Prussia was artillery. They had begun using Krupp's steel-barreled rifled breech-loading guns. These had a longer range, were more accurate, and fired much faster than the Danish bronze smoothbore guns. In the coming battles, it was the king of the battlefield who would decide the outcome. Initially, the Danish defense plan focused on the Danevirke, a system of earthen walls and fortifications that had stretched back to Viking times. For the Danes, the Danevirke was more than a military line. It was a sacred symbol of the nation, a wall that protected them from the Germanic world to the south. But in reality, the line was outdated and too long to be effectively defended with their small numbers. Worse still, the harsh winter had frozen the marshes that were supposed to protect their flanks. General de Meza quickly realized that holding out in Donnevirke would lead to disaster. His entire army could be bypassed and surrounded by Prussian-Austrian troops. On the night of 5th of February, just days after the war began, he made the most difficult and controversial decision of his career. He ordered the entire army to secretly retreat from Danevirke. The retreat was a logistical feat, but a political and moral disaster when news of the abandonment of the national symbol of Danevirke without a major battle reached Copenhagen. A wave of indignation erupted. The public felt betrayed. General de Meza, who had probably saved his army from destruction, was dismissed in disgrace. But his decision allowed the bulk of the Danish army to retreat safely to 2 key defensive positions. One part retreated to the north of the Jutland Peninsula, the other, and the best, concentrated in the fortifications at Dybbol. Dybbol, located opposite the strategic island of Alsen, was a fortress built to protect the eastern flank of the Danevirke. It consisted of a series of 10 small fortifications fortifications, redoubts, connected by trenches. For the Danes, Dybbol had now become a new symbol of resistance, a place where they would fight to the death to defend national honor. For the Prussians, the capture of Dybbol would be a decisive victory, breaking the Danish will to fight. While the Austrians advanced into Jutland, encountering almost no resistance, Prussian forces under the command of Prince Friedrich Karl, the king's nephew, began the siege of Dybbol in early March. The Prussians were in no hurry. They adopted a methodical siege tactic, a war of engineers and artillery that foreshadowed what would happen at Sevastopol in the Crimean War and later in World War I. They dug a system of parallel trenches, getting closer and closer to the Danish fortifications, and they brought in their most modern Krupp guns. From early April, a fierce, systematic artillery bombardment began. Tens of thousands of shells were dropped on the Danish fortifications, day after day. The earthworks designed to withstand smoothbore artillery were torn apart by the power and accuracy of the Prussian rifled guns. For the defending Danish soldiers, it was a living hell. They lived in ruined fortifications under constant artillery fire and had to repel Prussian probing attacks at night, but they held out stubbornly, supported by artillery from the island of Alsen and the firepower of the Danish Navy. The Danish Navy, superior to the Prussian-Austrian Navy, controlled the sea, blockaded German ports, and even won a small victory in the Battle of Heligoland. But that could not change the situation on land. By mid-April, the Danish fortifications were almost leveled. The Prussian trenches had advanced to the very foot of the fortifications. The final attack was being prepared. At 10 a.m. on April 18th, after a final fierce bombardment, the Prussian artillery suddenly fell silent. Then 10,000 Prussian shock troops poured out of the trenches and attacked the 6 fortifications on the left flank. The attack was carried out with astonishing speed and precision. The Danes, stunned by the bombardment and outnumbered, fought bravely, but in vain. The battle lasted for several hours, a brutal hand-to-hand fight in the ruined fortifications. But the outcome was decided. One by one, the fortifications fell. The Danes were forced to retreat in disarray towards the bridge to the island of Alsen, suffering heavy casualties under Prussian fire. The Battle of Dybbol was a decisive and comprehensive victory for Prussia. Nearly 5,000 Danish soldiers were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, compared to only about 1,200 Prussians. More importantly, the victory was a confirmation of the new Prussian military power. It demonstrated the effectiveness of military reforms, breech-loading rifles, and modern artillery. News of the victory at Dybbol sent a wave of national pride and patriotism throughout Prussia. It strengthened Bismarck's position and almost completely quelled liberal opposition. His blood and iron path seems to have been vindicated. For Denmark, the defeat at Dybbol was a national shock, a trauma that will haunt them for generations. Crushed militarily, they now have to place their last hope at the diplomatic table where the European powers are meeting in London. But can words save what guns have decided? The overwhelming Prussian victory at Dybbol caused alarm in European capitals, especially London. Britain, the world's leading naval power, was always wary of any change in the balance of power on the continent, especially the rise of a new military power capable of controlling the strategic coasts of the North Sea and Baltic. Although it did not take military action to protect Denmark, the British government, at the urging of Queen Victoria, was determined to broker a peace. On 25th April 1864, just a week after the Battle of Dybbol, the London Conference was convened. Representatives of all the great powers that had signed the London Protocol of 1852, Britain, France, Russia, Austria, Prussia, Sweden, along with representatives of the German Confederation and Denmark, sat down at the negotiating table. A ceasefire was agreed. For Denmark, this was the last ray of hope. They believed that, as in 1851, diplomatic pressure from the great powers would force Prussia and Austria to retreat and restore the pre-war situation. But the world had changed, and Otto von Bismarck was not a diplomat to be intimidated. He arrived in London from a position of absolute strength. His army occupied almost all of Jutland and Schleswig, and the victory at Dybbol had given him strong support at home. He knew that the other powers had no real will to intervene militarily. He played a masterful diplomatic game. The Danes initially took a hard line, demanding a return to the terms of the London Protocol of 1852, but Bismarck quickly rejected this. He claimed that Denmark itself had violated the treaty with the November Constitution, and therefore the treaty was no longer valid. He proposed a new solution, the complete independence of the two duchies, linked by a a common constitution. When the Danes refused, the negotiations turned to the possibility of dividing Schleswig along ethnic lines. This was an idea that the British supported, but the question was, where would that line be drawn? The Danes proposed a line in the south, giving them most of Schleswig. Bismarck, after consulting his generals, proposed a line further north, one that would give Prussia control of strategic defensive positions. The two sides could not come to a compromise. Throughout the conference, Bismarck skillfully exploited the disagreements between the great powers. He knew that Russia was still angry with Denmark and was sympathetic to Prussia. He also secured the support of Emperor Napoleon III of France by hinting at the benefits France could receive elsewhere. Britain was the only party that really wanted to help Denmark, but it could not act alone. The threat of intervention by British Prime Minister Lord Palmerston fell flat. The London Conference lasted 2 months, but achieved nothing. Bismarck had achieved his goal. He had shown the world that Prussia had tried to make peace, and that only a military solution could now solve the problem. At the end of June, the armistice ended. The London Conference broke down. Fighting resumed. There were no longer any diplomatic restraints. Supreme command of the Austro-Prussian Allied forces was now firmly in the hands of Prince Friedrich Karl. He was a decisive commander and did not want to waste time. He had already identified the next target that would deliver a knockout blow to Danish morale: the island of Alsen. Alsen was where the bulk of the remaining Danish army had retreated after the defeat at Dybbol. The island was protected by the narrow but strong current of the Alsen Strait and was supported by Danish naval gunboats, including the ironclad Rolf Krake. For the Danes, Alsen was their last stronghold in Schleswig. For the Prussians, its capture would be a military feat, a landing across the sea under enemy fire. On the night of June 29, 1864, 2,500 Prussian assault troops quietly crossed the Alsen Strait in hundreds of small boats. The attack was hidden by darkness and supported by a heavy artillery bombardment from over 100 Krupp guns on the Danish positions. The Danes were completely caught by surprise. The ironclad warship Rolf Krake attempted to intervene, but accurate Prussian artillery fire forced it to retreat. By dawn, the Prussians had established a strong bridgehead on the island. The Danes, overwhelmed and demoralized, offered little resistance. The battle was over quickly. The island of Alsen had fallen. More than 3,000 Danish soldiers had been taken prisoner. At the same time, the Austrian army had completed its occupation of the entire Jutland Peninsula. The news of the fall of Alsen completely crushed the remaining Danish will to fight. They had lost their main army and no longer had any hope of outside intervention. The Danish government was forced to ask for a ceasefire once again and accept negotiations, this time without the participation of the other powers. The final peace negotiations took place in Vienna. This time, there were no concessions from Germany. Bismarck had the initiative. Any Danish hopes of a referendum or a division of territory were dismissed. Denmark was forced to accept harsh terms. Under the Treaty of Vienna, the Danish king had to give up all his rights to the 3 duchies: Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg. For Denmark, this was a national disaster. Wait. They lost a third of their territory and nearly 40% of their population. The trauma of 1864 would haunt Danish politics and culture for generations, forcing them to abandon all great power ambitions and pursue a policy of neutrality. For Prussia and Bismarck, this was a complete victory. The duchies were now the common property of Prussia and Austria, but Bismarck had no intention of sharing power. He had deliberately created a complex general situation, a time bomb that he knew would inevitably lead to conflict with Austria. The Second Schleswig War was not the end, but only a prelude to a larger, more decisive war, the Austro-Prussian War, which would take place just 2 years later. The Second Schleswig War established Prussia as the leading military power in Europe. It demonstrated the strength of its reformed army, its new military technology, and Bismarck's ruthless diplomatic genius. It unleashed a wave of nationalism, strengthened the monarchy, and marginalized the liberals. The first step in the plan to unify Germany by blood and iron had been completed perfectly. The Second Schleswig War was not just a confrontation between two nations, it was a clash between two eras of military technology. While the courage and patriotism of the Danish soldiers were undeniable, they were faced with a cruel reality on the battlefield. They were fighting a war of the future with the tools of the past, and no tool demonstrated that disparity more clearly than the infantryman's rifle. The Danish army, like most European armies of the time, was equipped with a rifled bolt-action rifle. It was a powerful weapon, far more accurate and far more long range than the smoothbore muskets of the Napoleonic era, but it had one fatal flaw: the reloading process. The soldier had to stand upright, pour in gunpowder, and force the bullet down the barrel with a long ramrod. The whole process took about a minute and left the soldier completely exposed to enemy fire. In the nascent era of trench warfare, standing up meant death. The Prussian army, on the other hand, secretly equipped its entire regular force with a weapon that was ahead of its time: the breech-loading Dreiss rifle, or needle gun, Dünnnadelgewehr. Developed in the 1830s and put into use in secret, this gun was a true revolution. The soldier simply opened a breech at the rear, inserted a fused paper bullet, closed the breech, and fired. Its rate of fire could reach 5 to 7 rounds per minute, one many times faster than the Danish gun, but its greatest advantage was its ability to reload. A Prussian soldier could reload while lying prone, kneeling, or hiding behind cover. He could maintain a near-continuous barrage of fire while remaining protected. He became the predator on the battlefield, while his opponent was forced to become the prey. This superiority was tragically demonstrated in the early small battles and culminated at Dybbol. Danish officers reported in horror the rain of bullets they faced. Their men, standing up to reload, were cut down en masse by Prussian gunners hidden in plain sight. The old Danish tactic of attacking in dense formations was suicidal against the firepower of breech-loading guns. General Moltke Ene, chief of the Prussian General Staff, remarked coolly that the war had irrefutably demonstrated the value of the military reforms he and Bismarck had fought for. The technological revolution was not limited to rifles. In fact, the most decisive factor in sieges like Dybbol was artillery. Prussia was at the forefront of two major innovations: steel and breech loading. Their guns, manufactured by the giant industrial company Krupp, were made from cast steel rather than bronze or cast iron. This allowed them to withstand higher pressures, resulting in longer ranges and greater destructive power. More importantly, they were breech-loading guns with rifling. Like rifles, loading from the rear increased the rate of fire considerably, but it was the rifling in the gun barrel that changed the game. It gave the bullet a spin, stabilizing its flight and increasing accuracy to unprecedented levels. While Danish smoothbore guns fired unstable round bullets, Prussian Krupp guns could fire highly accurate cylindrical bullets at specific targets from miles away. The siege of Dybbol was a devastating display of modern artillery power. Prussian gunners carried out a scientific demolition, firing over 65,000 shells at Danish fortifications over several weeks. With great precision, they were able to concentrate their fire to destroy individual fortifications, disabling Danish batteries and turning trenches into death traps. The Danish soldiers, brave as they were, could do nothing but huddle together and endure the storm of steel. When the final infantry assault came, their defenses were essentially neutralized. It was a triumph of technology and industry over human courage. The battle also highlighted the growing importance of other elements in modern warfare. The Prussian army made effective use of the German railway network to concentrate and transport its troops to the border quickly, a logistical advantage that Denmark could not match. The telegraph was also used to allow the general staff in Berlin to communicate and command units in the field, a major step forward in the art of command and control. However, if Denmark lagged behind technologically on land, it was a different story at sea. Aware of its weakness on land, Denmark invested in a modern navy to protect its islands and coast. It was one of the first nations in the world to introduce ironclad warships. The Rolf Krake, built in Scotland, now was one of the most advanced warships of its time, with iron armor and rotating turrets designed by Captain Cowper Coles. The Danish Navy quickly established a blockade of Prussian ports in the North Sea and Baltic, causing considerable economic damage. The small Prussian and Austrian fleets, consisting mainly of wooden ships, were unable to challenge this dominance. In the Battle of Heligoland, an Austrian and Prussian squadron was defeated by the Danish Navy and forced to retreat. At Dybbol, the Rolf Krake played a vital role in supporting the defenders with its powerful firepower, but even superior Danish naval technology had its limits. During the attack on Alsen, accurate Prussian coastal artillery inflicted significant damage on the Rolf Krake and forced it back, failing to prevent the landings. The battle demonstrated an important lesson. In coastal operations, shore-based artillery could still be an effective counterweight to powerful naval fleets. In the end, the Second Schleswig War was a clear wake-up call. It demonstrated that in the industrial age, wars were no longer decided by courage or numbers of soldiers alone. They were decided by technology, by the power of factories, laboratories, and railways. Prussia, with its breech-loading rifles and steel cannons, showed itself to be a master of this new kind of warfare. The lessons learned from the bloody fields of Dybbol and Alsen would soon be applied on a much larger scale, against Austria and then France, in the quest to unify Germany with blood and iron. Dear Mother, I am well and safe, despite the constant gunfire day and night. We are in the fortifications at Dybbol. The Prussians are just ahead, so close we can hear them talking. Don't worry about me, glory awaits us, for king and country. Behind the grand strategies, the diplomatic intrigues, and the technological revolutions, every war is, in the end, a human story. It is the story of ordinary soldiers who suffered, fought, and died for the ideals they believed in. The Second Schleswig War, though brief, was no exception. It was a confrontation not only between armies, but also between two passionate patriots, two different conceptions of nation and identity. For the Danish soldiers, this was a just defensive war, a struggle for survival. They were fighting to defend Moder Danmark, motherland Denmark, from a giant invader. Many of them were conscripts, farmers, and craftsmen drafted into the army, fighting with incredible courage. In their letters home, they wrote of patriotism, of their duty to defend the historic border at Danevirke, and of their belief that God and the powers of Europe would be on their side. Their spirit, known as the Spirit of '84, became legendary in Denmark. Despite the enemy's technological superiority, they fought tenaciously at the outposts, in the rearguard actions, and especially in the desperate defense at Dybbol. They showed extraordinary tenacity under constant artillery fire. For them, Dybbol was more than just a cannon. The monument symbolized the indomitability of a small nation that stood up to the giants. Their sacrifice, even in defeat, became part of the foundation of modern Danish identity. One of the most famous stories is that of Corporal Niels Kjeldsen. During a battle, when his unit was surrounded, instead of surrendering, he hugged the Dannebrog flag to his body and threw himself into the river to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Such actions became stories that were retold, heroic tales of sacrifice and loyalty. On the other side, the Prussian and Austrian soldiers were motivated by a different kind of patriotism. For them, this was a war of liberation, a sacred duty to free their German brothers in Schleswig-Holstein from foreign rule. In their letters, they wrote of German unity, of fighting for a common Vaterland, fatherland. For the Prussian soldier, the war was also an opportunity to prove the worth of his reformed army, to wash away the memory of the hesitation of the First World War. They had an almost absolute belief in their technical and organizational superiority. They were proud of their breech-loading rifles and Krupp cannons, but they also faced the brutality of war. Many young soldiers, brought up in peace, were shocked by the sight of their fallen comrades and the fierce resistance of the Danes. They also suffered from cold, disease, and homesickness. But there was a fundamental difference in their experiences. While the Danish soldier fought with a growing sense of isolation and despair, the German-Austrian soldier fought with a growing sense of confidence, believing that they were part of an unstoppable winning machine, carrying out a great historical mission. While the soldiers were fighting and dying on the battlefield, another, no less fierce, war was taking place in Copenhagen. The political crisis had erupted as soon as General de Meza ordered the withdrawal of troops from the Danevirke. The National Liberal government, led by Prime Minister D.G. Monrad, who had drafted the November Constitution and plunged Denmark into war, faced a fierce wave of criticism. They had bet everything on British and Swedish intervention, a gamble that had completely failed. Now, isolated diplomatically and crushed militarily, they did not know what to do. The public and the opposition demanded a fight to the death to defend national honor, while military reality showed that such resistance was hopeless. King Christian IX, a more realistic man, tried to find a peaceful solution, but he was constrained by the Constitution and a belligerent government. The fall of Dybbol brought the crisis to a head. The Monrad government was forced to resign. A new conservative government was formed, but it could do nothing but face the bitter reality of defeat. The inability of politicians to face reality contributed no small part to the Danish disaster. In Prussia and the German states, by contrast, the victory created an unprecedented wave of national unity and pride. The liberals, who had bitterly opposed Bismarck's rule without a budget, were now won over by his success. They saw that the very army they had refused to finance had now won a great victory for the German national cause. Bismarck skillfully used this victory to consolidate his power and weaken the opposition. He demonstrated that his blood and iron path, not parliamentary speeches, was the way to unify Germany. The war transformed him from a hated politician into an admired leader, a symbol of Prussian strength and will. The rising tide of nationalism drowned out calls for democratic freedom. For many in the German middle class, a strong, unified nation was now more important than a liberal constitution. The war also had a profound impact on the relations between the German states. Austria, though an ally, played a secondary role to Prussia. It was clear that Prussia, not Austria, was the real military and political power of the Germans. The cooperation in the war was only temporary. Both Bismarck and the leaders in Vienna knew that a final confrontation for control of a unified Germany was inevitable. The common war against Denmark was only a prelude to the fratricide to come. The Treaty of Vienna in October 1864 formally transferred sovereignty over the three duchies of Schleswig, Holstein, and Lauenburg from the King of Denmark to the King of Prussia and the Emperor of Austria. In name, the two German powers had jointly liberated these lands and would rule them together. But for Otto von Bismarck, victory over Denmark was never the ultimate goal. It was only the first step in a much larger plan. Now he faced a more difficult question: how to turn this common victory into Prussia's own benefit. Bismarck had no intention of sharing control of the duchies with Austria. He saw them as a war prize that Prussia, the nation that had shed the most blood and toil, deserved to enjoy in full. The annexation of the duchies would not only bring territorial and population benefits, but would also have invaluable strategic importance. It would connect Prussia's eastern and western provinces and provide Prussia with the port of Kiel, a deep water port ideal for building a powerful future naval fleet. But how could Austria be legally removed from the picture without being seen as an aggressor? Bismarck sowed the seeds of discord from the start. He rejected all other options. He opposed granting the duchies to the locally favored candidate, Prince Frederick of Augustenburg, for fear that a newly independent state would side with Austria. He also did not want immediate annexation, as that would make Prussia look like a belligerent. Instead, he proposed a seemingly reasonable but in fact fraught solution, a Prussian-Austrian condominium over both duchies. This was a masterpiece of cunning. A condominium between two rival powers with two different administrative, legal, and military systems operating in the same territory would inevitably lead to conflict. Austria, whose main territory was far to the south, without a direct border with the duchies, would be at a huge disadvantage in terms of administration. Meanwhile, Prussia, with its occupying army and long border, had the full initiative. Bismarck had deliberately created an apple of discord, a constant source of conflict that he could exploit at any time he wanted, and conflicts quickly arose. Just as Bismarck had predicted, in Austrian-controlled Holstein, pro-Augustenburg movements were allowed to operate. But in Prussian-controlled Schleswig, they were brutally suppressed. Prussian troops controlled the transport and communication routes, making Austrian administration difficult. Disputes over tariffs, canals, and naval bases broke out constantly. The atmosphere between the two old allies became increasingly tense and filled with suspicion. By the summer of 1865, the situation was close to the brink of war. Both sides began to mobilize their armies, but Bismarck was not ready. The Prussian army still needed time to consolidate after the war, and more importantly, he had not yet completed his diplomatic preparations. He needed to ensure that when war with Austria broke out, Austria would be completely isolated, so he temporarily de-escalated. In August 1865, the Convention of Gastein was signed. On the surface, it seemed like a solution to the crisis. The common rule was over. Instead, Prussia would directly administer Schleswig, while Austria would administer Holstein. Prussia also acquired Lauenburg from Austria. To observers, this seemed like a reasonable arrangement, but for Bismarck, it was just a way of sticking paper over the cracks. He knew that dividing the two duchies, which were declared forever indivisible, would only increase tensions. An Austrian administration of Holstein, a land sandwiched between Prussian territory, was militarily indefensible. The Gastein Convention was not a solution, it was merely a stepping stone, a way to buy time while Bismarck prepared for the decisive blow. In the following months, Bismarck worked tirelessly to weave a perfect diplomatic trap around Austria. The most important link was France. He met Napoleon III at Biarritz and made vague promises. He suggested that if France remained neutral in an Austro-Prussian war, they might be compensated with some French-speaking territory in Belgium or on the Rhine. Napoleon III, believing that such a war would prolong and weaken both German powers, giving France the opportunity to mediate and profit, agreed to remain neutral. He did not realize that he was being manipulated by Bismarck. Bismarck next turned to Italy. In April 1866, he signed a secret military alliance with the Kingdom of Italy. According to the agreement, if war broke out within 3 months, Italy would attack Austria from the south. In return, Prussia would guarantee that Italy would receive the province of Venetia from Austria after victory. Now Austria would face a war on 2 fronts. Russia still remembered Austria's ungratefulness in the Crimean War and was prepared to maintain friendly neutrality towards Prussia. Britain, following its policy of non-interference in continental affairs, would also stay out of the picture. The trap was set. Austria was completely isolated. Now all Bismarck needed was a casus belli. He found it in Holstein. He accused Austria of violating the Gastein Convention by allowing activities in support of Augustenborg. Then, in a final provocation, he proposed a complete reform of the German Confederation, including the creation of a parliament elected by universal suffrage, an idea he knew the conservative Austrian Empire could never accept. When Austria responded by bringing the Schleswig-Holstein issue before the Confederation Council and mobilizing its army, Bismarck declared that Austria had violated the treaty. He ordered Prussian troops to occupy Holstein. The Austro-Prussian War had begun. The conflict that had begun in the small lands of the north had now exploded into a German civil war, one that would decide the fate of Central Europe. The apple of discord that Bismarck had sown after his victory over Denmark had finally ripened, and it was about to yield him a great harvest: Prussian domination over all of Germany. The Second Schleswig War, in retrospect, seems to have been a minor conflict, a prelude to the larger and bloodier wars that would soon shake Europe. It is often overshadowed by the drama of Königgrätz or the Sedan disaster. But to underestimate its significance would be a mistake. The War of 1864 was not simply a war for the acquisition of 2 duchies. It was a decisive turning point. It was the laboratory, the dress rehearsal, and the indispensable first step in Otto von Bismarck's brilliant and ruthless plan for the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. The most important legacy of the war was the assertion of the new Prussian military power. It proved beyond doubt that the military reforms that King Wilhelm I von Roon and Moltke had fought for were absolutely correct. The Prussian army, with its breech-loading rifles, modern artillery, an efficient mobilization system, and an excellent general staff, showed all of Europe that it was the most formidable military force on the continent. The victory at Dybbol was not only a victory over Denmark, it was also a warning to Vienna and Paris. In domestic politics, the war gave Bismarck a resounding victory. It transformed him from a hated chancellor who ruled unconstitutionally into a national hero, a leader who had won a great victory for the German cause. The wave of patriotism that followed the victory drowned out the opposition of the liberals. They were conquered by success. The conflict over the Prussian constitution essentially ended, not with a compromise, but with the surrender of liberalism to the power of nationalism and militarism. The path to a unified Germany, but one without a solid democratic culture, was set. For Denmark, the legacy of 1864 was a national tragedy. The defeat was not just a military defeat, it was a profound psychological shock. Denmark lost the status of a regional power it had held for centuries. Having lost Schleswig-Holstein, it became a small country. The trauma of 1864 completely reshaped Denmark's identity and foreign policy. It abandoned all military ambitions and pursued a policy of strict neutrality, focusing on rebuilding the country from within under the slogan, "What is lost outside will be regained inside." It was not until after World War I, through a referendum, that the northern part of Schleswig returned to Denmark. The war also exposed the impotence and indecision of other European powers. Concert of Europe could not prevent an invasion. Britain had made loud threats but failed to act, damaging its reputation. France and Russia, for their own reasons, stayed out. Bismarck had learned an important lesson. The great powers would intervene only when their direct interests were at stake, and he could exploit their disagreements to further his own aims. This confidence would underpin his bolder diplomatic gambles in the wars to come. But perhaps the most subtle and important legacy of the war was how Bismarck turned it into a perfect trap for Austria. By drawing Austria into a common war, he temporarily concealed his true intentions and created a cover of legitimacy for Prussia's actions. And then, by creating a contradictory general administration, he sowed the apple of discord that he knew would inevitably lead to conflict. The Second Schleswig War was not a single act. It was designed from the outset to be the immediate cause of the next decisive war with Austria. Just 2 years later, when Bismarck had completed his diplomatic preparations, he triggered his trap. The Austro-Prussian War broke out, and in 7 short weeks, the army that had been tested at Dybbol crushed the Austrian army at Königgrätz. Austria was expelled from Germany. The North German Confederation was established. The second stage of Bismarck's plan was complete. The War of 1864 was the first lesson in a new type of warfare initiated by Prussia: Kabinettskrieg. Cabinet wars. These were short, limited-aim wars, carefully calculated and directed by politicians to achieve specific foreign policy goals. They were not total wars aimed at the destruction of the enemy. Bismarck used war as an instrument of policy, an extension of diplomacy by other means. As the Prussian military theorist Clausewitz put it, the Second Schleswig War, therefore, cannot be seen in isolation. It was the first link in a series of 3 unifying wars that would completely reshape the map of Europe and give birth to the German Empire, a force that would dominate world history for the next century. It was the first demonstration of Prussian military power and Bismarck's diplomatic genius, a combination that would prove unstoppable. From the windswept fields and earthworks of a distant frontier, a storm was unleashed, a storm forged in Prussian discipline, fueled by German nationalism, and steered by the iron will of one man. That storm, which began at Dybbol, would soon sweep through Königgrätz, then Sedan, and would finally converge at Versailles, where a new empire would be proclaimed on the glories of military victory. The story of blood and iron had only just begun. The Second Schleswig War was the perfect showcase for Bismarck's blood and iron policy. For you, was this a just war of national liberation or merely a ruthless diplomatic gamble by a master politician to unify Germany? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Our debate will shed more light on one of the most complex issue in European history. And if you find analyses like this valuable, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to continue following our journey to German unification.